a long one down to around the 3-yard line. Ward Tuff takes it. He's cutting up to his left. He's over the 10. Nice block there by Lehman. Tuff still going. He's up to the 25. And now he's hit and hit hard about the 27-yard line. Bruiser Kennard made the tackle.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
At this time, I want to share with you a video, and it's a patriotic video, but I think it's a significant message to it and a good way to start our program.
In the grip of oppression, I fought for my liberty. I paid with the blood of my people. Freedom has never been free. Now my door's always open to dreamers and friends. When I'm attacked, I protect and defend, because my name is America. I stand proud and free. My name is America. Don't tread on me. I cannot be broken. I cannot be shamed. If you hurt me, I'll get stronger, and I'll rise up from the flames, and I'll always stand proud and free. I'm America, don't tread on me. America is my name. My strength was not taken from others. Others gave it to me. They believe in the virtues I stand for, my respect for humanity. Now I'm challenged by tyrants who envy my power, but their vicious deeds become my finest hour. Because my name is America, I stand proud and free. My name is America, don't tread on me. I cannot be broken, I cannot be shamed. If you hurt me, I'll get strong,
At this time, I want to introduce a friend in Morrison-Reeves Library, reference librarian, Steve. And Steve is going to tell his story, or not his story, but a story that was shared with him by a Pearl Harbor survivor who lived in Richmond. Steve Martin. Go ahead, Steve.
On December 7th, 1941, 22-year-old Chief Petty Officer Guy L. Becerra of Richmond, Indiana, was at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base on the USS West Virginia, preparing to raise its flag. It was 8 a.m., and there were no sounds other than distant church bells. In his words, this is what happened. I had the watch on the quarterdeck and was just standing by to hoist the stars and stripes when suddenly a reflection of sunlight on falling objects caught my eyes. I looked up and saw 4 powerful detonations about a quarter of a mile away in the fork of the channel. The officer on deck and I both stared that direction, and we saw Japanese planes approaching our bow with the emblem of the rising sun emblazoned on her wings. The planes were upon us. 2 torpedoes hit us amidship to port. The heavy crash of big bombs smashed away into the bows of our ship. The loud chatter of machine gun fire, the sudden lurch of the ship as a torpedo found its mark. Ammo magazines were exploding. Instantly, men began running to the battle stations. Scared? I'll say I was scared. It was a queer feeling not knowing if you'll be alive the next moment, or whether a bomb is going to land on your lap and blow you to bits. As I passed through the main deck, more torpedoes hit the ship in approximately the same place as before. The ship started listing to port, and it seemed as though it would capsize, but the first lieutenant and his dangerous crews had been on the job, and the ship was soon counter-flooded, and she returned it to an almost even keel, although she was settling to the bottom fast. All the while we were being strafed and bombed, our own anti-aircraft fire was going up, but the din was horrific. A 1,000-pound bomb hit the superstructure and smashed through the signal bridge, down into the galley, and through into the commission issuing room. The noise was like a runaway train. The bomb did not explode, luckily for me, for I was standing just outside the compartment at the time and could hear the ticking. There were 4 or 5 men killed just by the concussion. Fire was raging all over the topside to port and was completely out of control. I tried to reach the conning tower and saw that men were using anti-aircraft weaponry to shoot at the Japanese planes. I was momentarily heartened. I overtook the bedlam and ran down to the second deck and tried to get down to the central station, but all the hatches were closed and I could not get through. So I went down to the sound deck preparatory to going up through the conning tower, but the lights had all gone out and I could not see my way along. The fuel tanks had been ruptured and the smell of oil was strong, so strong in fact that the fumes finally overcame me and I collapsed. And the next thing I remembered, I was on the forecastle in the living quarters, several shipmates having dragged me out. I was feeling rather groggy. The ships were being bombed by the Japs who were strafing us, but I was in such condition that nothing seemed to matter as far as my own personal safety was concerned. I was mad clear through and wanted to get on an aircraft gun, but there were more volunteers than needed. By this time, the ship was resting on the bottom, but still the main deck was above water. The entire forward part of the ship was in flames, and the oil on the water around the ship was burning fiercely. Then, and only then, came the order to abandon ship. Men dove over the side and swam to shore about 50 yards distant. I and a party of about 30 men climbed into a life raft and started paddling around the bow of the Tennessee, which had been tied up inboard of us, but we weren't making much headway, and we realized that we could never make it, as the burning oil on the water was coming too close for comfort. Finally, we gave up on the raft, and it was every man for himself. I still had on my shoes, and I could hardly swim. I didn't think I had time to take them off, and several times I thought I was going down, but managed to overcome my weariness enough to go a little further. I finally reached the starboard side of the Tennessee and grabbed hold of her pair of chains to rest for a few minutes. By that time, the oil fire on the water had spread so that I could not see the beach. That left me either to be burned alive by the oil or drowned, or to attempt climbing up the chains and over the bow of the Tennessee. Japanese bullets strafed. Kamikaze pilots were shooting helpless sailors. I was hit in the knee but didn't know it at the time. I was so tired and weak, I didn't believe it possible. But the strength a man has when fighting for his life, hand over hand, inch by inch, foot by foot, forced me ahead. I crawled painfully up about 30 feet of chain, and where whelping hands helped me. I finally collapsed and lay exhausted on the decimated battleship. From there, I witnessed the destruction of the U.S. fleet. These are the words of just one man from Wayne County and what he experienced at Pearl Harbor that day.
Thank you, Steve. A footnote, I should say, or an addendum to that story, Guy was on that ship with his brother, Ed Becerra. Both of them on the same ship. They didn't know what happened to one another. The parents had not heard what happened to them. And then 18 days later, somebody came to the door at the grandmother's house and said both boys had survived. I believe it was a guy that was wounded. Ironically, both boys had sent a telegram to their parents letting them know that they were alive, and both telegrams arrived on the same day. Another interesting fact that is important to remember is that during the war, there were 8 men from Wayne County and Richmond who were at Pearl Harbor. No, I think they were all from Richmond, as I think about. Now, consider that. I would imagine that there are not very many cities in the United States the size of Richmond that would have 8 people actually at Pearl Harbor for a first-hand account. Today, I'll share some stories, one of those from Richmond, others from men I interviewed who were there as well. When I do this, I'm only going to share excerpts. I'm not going to read their story. I'm just going to kind of combine and share some of the excerpts so you can get the feeling of what Steve was saying about what these men experienced. So before I do that, I want to make a comment which I think sums it up very, very well when we think of the men at Pearl Harbor and any of you veterans who served no matter what war or conflict. And President John F. Kennedy, he said, "A nation is remembered by not how only it remembers its veterans, but how it honors them as well." And by sharing these stories, we hope we can honor these men. And obviously, there are women who served bravely too, and some of their stories are captured in the book. Here are some of those Pearl Harbor memories, excerpts from these stories that you will see in the books. It was sheer terror, noise, and confusion. Men were running for cover everywhere, not knowing what was happening. Again, what Steve was saying about Guy. Many thought it was our planes accidentally dropping bombs on us because they had been doing maneuvers over Pearl Harbor for several weeks. The ships were dry docked, and the Japanese came in with their torpedo bombers and fighter pilots and kamikazes just unmercifully on the ships that were there. As he said, men jumped overboard from their ships trying to survive. Oil, fire burning in the water. One man said he saw men actually on fire as they were in the water. Other men were drowning because their ship was sinking and the suction was pulling them under. Now, everything I'm telling you are accounts that these men shared with me. One man from Richmond, he said that when I got on deck and knew that we were being strafed and hit by the Japanese dive bombers and planes, he said, I grabbed a 50-pound box of ammunition in one hand, climbed a ladder with the other hand to get it to our gunners. He said, I weighed 150 pounds. There are those who feel, and more than one that I interviewed, that we should have known the attack was coming. there were indicators that it was. If you read the story today in the paper about the 100-year-old man who was a survivor at Pearl Harbor that lives up in northern Indiana, his ship was coming back, and he said, we noted a periscope from a submarine heading to the island. We called it in. No response. Also, men who were on radar on that day had seen a massive blip of some type of air movement coming towards the island. They radioed that in. Nothing was done. So consequently, some of the men I talked to felt that attack could have been avoided. There are others who said that was an excuse to get us into World War II. We don't know that, but there were really strong feelings of many of these men who were there. And one of them said, the reason I felt this way is because for months we had been practicing drills, we had been doing blackouts, and we had been using live ammunition as we were practicing. So there were concerns, obviously, about the whole issue. The biggest one I thought was interesting was when this question was asked, how could we not be aware of a huge naval armada that traveled 3,500 miles and staged for the attack just 250 miles off Pearl Harbor? Now, radar wasn't then what it is now. We know that. But that raises a question that I would have myself. Some guys said the planes were flying so low that you could actually see the faces of the Japanese pilots. One man recounted that he was playing touch football out on the parade grounds when the planes came in. And two guys ran out in the open field with Browning automatic rifles and shot down two Japanese planes that were flying in low over the island. One man said, I was on the USS Nevada when I saw the Arizona explode. Now, the Arizona was the one that just sank, I think, within 12 to 15 minutes, and over 1,000 men died in that steel coffin, as well as others who died in the water and were not able to be rescued. Another interesting fact, many men, and I think Steve made reference to this, or many people did not know that the Japanese had two-man mini submarines that were also attacking our ships. Later on, there was an attempt to attack our coasts with the two-man submarines, but they were detected and stopped. And after the attack, this is what a young man told me. I remember thinking I should have stayed home and in high school rather than enlisted. I was only 17 years old and to not even have graduated. Another veteran said, I was standing in the chow line when the bombers and the fighter pilots came in strafing. He said hundreds of men were in the mess hall, some were in their barracks, and others were on the parade grounds playing games or touch football, as I mentioned that one. And he said, you know, we were just sitting ducks, as were our ships who were lined up on Battleship Row. Well, there are other stories that certainly can be told about the experience at Pearl Harbor. While I did not interview this man, I think it's an important story to know, and that is there was a man named Doris Miller. Maybe you've heard the story. A lot of people don't know about it. He was a black man. At that time, blacks were not considered, and this is true, intelligent enough or had the courage enough to be in combat, and they were not allowed to fight. When the attack occurred on his ship, which was later sunk, he was down below as a cook and a laundry mate. He heard it, ran up to the top of the deck, grabbed a machine gun, and shot down, they think, between 2 and 4 Japanese planes. He'd never operated a machine gun in his life. He received the Navy Cross, the second highest combat award. However, it's interesting. There was a white man who did something similar, and he got the Medal of Honor. Later, Doris Miller, a aircraft carrier was named in his honor, the USS Doris Miller. And his face was on a recruiting poster that said, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Doris Miller never made it back home. His ship was sunk in the Pacific, and he was killed with numerous other men. So that's just some of what was shared with me at Pearl Harbor. But I think I would be remiss if I didn't share somewhat of some memories of those who were other campaigns during World War II. Because see, we fought on 3 fronts in World War II. A lot of people don't remember this. The Pacific Theater, the European Theater, and the Chinese-Burma India Theater. And stories from all of those theaters are found in there, including men who were on D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Bastogne, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Guadalcanal. First-hand accounts of what they remembered. Just a couple of these I will share. He said, at Bastogne, we were surrounded by the Germans. He said, they sent in replacement troops who were 18, 19-year-old kids with no combat experience. Now, I want to share another thing that a Vietnam veteran told me when I was interviewing him. He said many of our pilots, of our chopper Huey pilots that flew in to drop off troops or to take troops out, he said a lot of those were 18, 19-year-old kids. He said they were fearless. And they flew in there in those what they called hot zones or landing zones to extract the soldiers or the injured ones as well. One veteran helped to liberate the notorious Buchenwald extermination camp. And he said, I will never forget the horror that I saw. Bodies stacked like cords of wood, and you've seen pictures. Body parts hanging out of extermination ovens. This man actually was able to take some personal pictures of which he had and shared with me. And he said, I could never understand how one person or how people could be so inhumane in the treatment of another human being. One man who landed at Guadalcanal received the Silver Star. He was only 22 years old. And he said, as soon as we landed, we were engaged in a 3-day battle of intensive fighting. And he said the Japanese would dig themselves into tunnels and caves. They had miles and miles of caves or tunnels underground, which they had fortified. And he said one of the biggest fears I had and other fellow soldiers had, Marines, was at night they would do banzai attacks. And he said those attacks were terrifying because they would charge in waves at us. He said they would be playing bugles, screaming, firing their weapons. And finally, a veteran said, you know, one of the most terrible things I saw was when the Japanese shot at our stretcher bearers. And that way they could eliminate 4 or 5 troops at one time. One thing I learned is that for the most part, the Germans, honored what treaty am I thinking of? Got a mental. Geneva Convention. They honored the Geneva Convention. The Japs did not. And that's what they said. They were the Japs to them, not being politically correct with that. One veteran said, I saw a young man that probably couldn't have been over 17, 18 years old, running off the beach at Okinawa, holding his guts in with one hand and his rifle in the other. And the last experience I will share with you is a Marine who told me, and my dad had a similar experience, as did many other veterans. They were called angels on my shoulder. When something happened where they thought they should have been killed, and they weren't. And many of them questioned that years later. This man was on a beach in Peleliu. He was walking along they were looking for their dead and wounded comrades. He said, I was walking, and all of a sudden I heard somebody say, don't go there, don't step there. And he said, I stopped, I looked around, nobody. Nobody was there but me. And he said, when I looked back down on the sand, there was a mine protruding from the sand. He said, if the tide had not gone out and washed that away, I would have stepped on it and most likely been killed. And a lot of men shared similar stories. My father, who was in the Pacific in New Guinea, shared a story. One time they were at their camp there in the jungle, and a buddy of his asked him to go up to headquarters and to get the mail. And my dad said no, he was too busy. He was working in a MASH unit at the time. Well, about an hour later, they brought the guy back dead. His head had been blown off by a Japanese sniper. My dad would have been in that Jeep with that man. But there were also humorous stories that people shared, and in some of these books you'll find them. Again, one I remember, my dad, he said that at night, he said one night we saw all of these lights and, just eyes, peering across and looking at us. And we thought, the Japanese are really out there and going to come. And actually they were monkeys. So there are a lot of humorous things that men remember, but of course the terror obviously was there. Because what these men experienced was loneliness, homesickness, boredom, uncertainty, sheer terror, as Steve mentioned. But the atrocities some of them saw were just unbelievable. But they also witnessed numerous acts of bravery and courage. One veteran said, if you haven't experienced war, you cannot truly understand the sights, smells, and sounds and the horrors you experience. In closing, I think we would do well to remember the words of President Harry Truman. And he said, for the living and the dead, we owe our eternal greatness, for it is a debt that can never be fully repaid.